Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to analyse Wilfred Owen's haunting poem Futility. Wilfred Owen was a soldier poet of the First World War who wrote some of the most evocative poems from the Western Front. Futility is a quieter poem than some of his others, but its scope is epic. It's not about the heat of battle, but the cold anger, the cold resentment, the cold frustration that settles afterwards. So in terms of the lecture today, I'm going to start with a quick background to the poet and to the poem. So I'm going to start with a quick biography of Wilfred Owen and provide some context for the poem Futility. I'm then going to provide a summary of the poem, so its overall meaning, and then I'm going to get into some close textual analysis of the poem. So I'm going to look at the poem's form. It's a modified sonnet. I'm going to look at its rhyme scheme, and in particular I want to look at Wilfred Owen's use of pararhyme, as it's called, which is a technique that he particularly excelled in and particularly kind of perfected and played with. I'm then going to look at the metre. I then want to compare and contrast some of the formal, structural kind of elements and aspects of the first and the second stanzas, and how the form, think about how the form and how the structure kind of help us understand the meaning within each stanza and therefore the kind of movement in the poem and the overall meaning of the poem. I then want to look at some of the allusions, so the classical epic allusions, the biblical allusions, and some of the literary allusions. There's a lot packed into this little poem. And then I want to close by considering the kind of meta-textual irony, potentially, of the poem's title, Futility. So I'm going to start with a biography of Wilfred Owen and some context for his poem, Futility. Futility was written in May 1918, that is 4 years into the First World War. I spoke in a previous video about Wilfred Owen's military career and the autobiographical elements of Wilfred Owen's experiences that found their way into his poetry, as we see from his letters home to his mother, Susan Owen. And an example of the autobiographical nature of Owen's poetry is the poem Futility. In a letter of the 4th of February 1917, just a month or so after Wilfred Owen arrived at the front line, he wrote home to his mother describing the perilous freezing conditions. He wrote, "My platoon had to lie in the snow under the deadly wind. By day it was impossible to stand up or even crawl about." So they're lying in the snow and they can't even stand up. "We had 5 Tommy's cookers between the platoon, but they did not suffice to melt the ice in the water cans. So even their drinking water is frozen. So we suffered cruelly from thirst. The marvel is that we did not all die of cold. As a matter of fact, only one of my party actually froze to death. We were marooned on a frozen desert. There is not a sign of life on the horizon, and 1,000 signs of death." And this experience, this man freezing to death, directly inspired the poem Futility. So in May 1917, so about a year before Owen wrote the poem, Owen was diagnosed as having neurasthenia, otherwise known as shell shock, after enduring some absolutely appalling experiences at the front, where he had arrived in January 1917, only 5 months previously, including having to hide in a shell hole for days on end with the decomposing body of a man he knew. Wilfred Owen was evacuated back to Britain, and in late June 1917 he arrived at Craiglockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh, near Edinburgh, which specialised in treating mental health conditions. And it was part of his treatment, which was prescribed by Owen's doctor, Captain Arthur John Brock. And part of the treatment was to confront and process his traumatising experiences through writing poetry. So writing poetry was essentially a part of the healing process. In November 1917, Wilfred Owen returned to his regiment in Yorkshire in the north of England and undertook light duties. And this was a particularly productive period for him, poetically speaking. So between March and June 1918, Owen revised many of his kind of previously drafted poems and wrote others, such as Futility, as I said, in May 1918. Written almost a year then, after Owen had been away from active service at the front, I think we can see that the poem Futility has a particular sense of reflectiveness, by which I mean that it is not a poem about the rage and the heat of battle, as some of Wilfred Owen's other better known, perhaps, poems are. Dulce et decorum est, for example, describes the horror of a front-line gas attack. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling. You're right, sort of there in the moment, and the gargling of the froth-corrupted lungs, he describes. Rather, Futility is a poem about trying to cope with the mental anguish that comes afterwards. So Futility was published in Wilfred Owen's lifetime. It was first published on the 15th of June 1918 in the Nation magazine. And in fact, Futility is one of a handful, only 5, of Owen's published poems that were published in his lifetime. So the others were Song of Songs and The Next War, which were published in the Hydra magazine, which was Craiglockhart Hospital's kind of in-house publication, and 3 others in the Nation magazine. So Minors in the edition of the 29th of January 1918, and Hospital Barge and Futility were published together alongside each other in the June 1918 edition. And I think it's interesting here to note that the poems that Owen himself chose to publish are not his most well-known poems now. So what did Owen want from his publication of poems, and how is that different to what we now really as kind of readers of poetry want from First World War poetry? Because there's a bit of a disparity there, which I think is quite interesting. So in the same month, June 1918, Wilfred Owen was declared fit for general service. He was recommended for a home posting, but it was rejected. So in August 1918, during the final advance on the German lines, Wilfred Owen found himself in France fighting once again, where he died a week before Armistice Day. Turning to the poem itself. Move him into the sun. Gently its touch awoke him once at home, whispering of fields half sown. Always it woke him, even in France, until this morning and this snow. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. Our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? So that's from Futility, published in The Nation on the 15th of June 1918. So To summarise quickly then the poem, the first stanza concerns the freezing either dead or dying man, with the speaker hoping, exhorting the sun to warm him back into life, into reviving, into rousing again. The second stanza reflects on the broader implications of the dying of this one man and the speaker's existential crisis that the dying of the man boy provokes. So the speaker wonders, what is the point of all the sun's toil and work in bringing seeds and bodies to life if it is all just for this? Just for this war, just for this destruction. The sun heats and lights the earth, day after day after day after day, in order to make and sustain life. But why bother if all that dear achieved life is just wasted? The poem Futility might appear sort of conversational and loose, but it is actually incredibly highly and tightly structured. The structure of futility. So it's a modified sonnet. We can see the development of the poem over various manuscripts. So in an early draft version of the poem, we can see that originally it had 12 lines overall, 6 in the first stanza and 6 in the second. So the line endings in that original draft were sun once, unsown France, now no, and in the second stanza, grain, star, groan, stir, toil, all. But in later drafts, a line was inserted into both stanzas, and the additional line was inserted into the same position in each stanza. So the addition became the fifth line in both. So the lines ending snow and tall, until this morning and this snow. And in the second stanza, was it for this the clay grew tall? And so it affects the rhyme scheme, as I will get onto in a little bit more detail in a minute. And additionally, the line was it for this the clay grew tall has lots of allusions, classical, epic, and other allusions, which I will also get onto. So it's a very important line in those terms too. But for now, what I want to focus on is that Owen makes a conscious structural amendment to the poem in order to make it a modified sonnet by inserting these two additional lines. So the addition of these two lines turns the poem, as I said, into a sonnet, not the usual standard sonnet form, but a modified sonnet form. To outline briefly what sonnet forms are. So a Petrarchan sonnet, kind of traditional sonnet form, is made up of an octet, 8 lines, sometimes called an octave, and then a volta, which is the pause in between the first stanza and second stanza, and then a sestet, so 6 lines. A Shakespearean sonnet, slightly different. It's made up of 3 quatrains. Quatrains are 4 lines of poetry. So it's 3 quatrains and then a closing rhyming couplet. But Owen's Futility is composed of 2 septets, as they're called, so 7 lines each. Romanticism especially drew on and developed the sonnet form. In a Romantic period sonnet, the volta, or the turn, is a kind of crucial element of the form. So stanza 1 establishes a thought. The volta breaks away from that thought momentarily, and then the thought established in stanza 1 is interrogated and unpicked and reflected upon in the second stanza. So the Romantics, such as William Wordsworth, for example, in his kind of political poems of the very early 19th century, developed the sonnet into a kind of philosophically interrogative form, which is what Wilfred Owen draws on here. And incidentally, Wilfred Owen was a huge admirer of romantic poets, particularly John Keats, and you can see that it's very evident in his aural playfulness and the way that he plays with vowels, which is something that John Keats does too, and it's called kind of vowel music. So you vary the vowels as much as possible, and both Keats and Owen really do that. They play with the kind of aural quality of vowels. The volta in Futility marks a seismic shift between the two stanzas and the focus of the two stanzas. So is the volta in Futility perhaps a change from last gasp hope fullness to the onset of a kind of bleak, quiet but desperate hopelessness? I'll get on to thinking a bit more about that later when I compare the two stanzas. But first I want to examine the rhyme scheme of Futility, and I want to focus on pararhyme. So what is pararhyme? Pararhyme is a technique that Wilfred Owen uses frequently in his poetry, and he really kind of developed it as a technique. In a letter to Siegfried Sassoon of the 6th of December 1917, Owen referred to the technique in a different poem of his, but the technique as his vowel rhyme stunt. My vowel rhyme stunt, he writes. So this is kind of playing with rhyme through the vowel sounds. So pararhyme is a half rhyme, otherwise known as an imperfect rhyme or a near rhyme or a slant rhyme, in which there is vowel variation with the same consonant pattern. So pararhyme is where the consonants of sort of stressed syllables or kind of highlighted sounds, stressed sounds, consonant sounds, agree, but the vowel sounds do not match. In other words, there is rich consonants, but no assonance. So in Futility, the pararhymes are sun, sown. So you can see that the consonant sounds are the same, S and N, sun and sown, but there is no assonance, there is no rhyme in the vowel sound. Then you've got once and France, you've got snow and no, and the pararhyme now, seeds and sides, star and stir, tall and at all, and toil. So these pararhymes are subtle and not as noticeable as full rhymes, but the overall structure of the rhyme is actually very rigid in this poem. So in both stanzas, it's A, B, C, 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 with a mixture of pararhymes and full rhymes. In terms of pararhymes then, A is a pararhyme and B is a pararhyme in the first stanza, but C is a mixture of full rhymes and pararhymes. So you've got C full, C half para, and then C full. And the half rhyme is emphasised by being surrounded by the full rhymes. So snow, now, no. And that pattern is repeated in the second stanza, where you have the full rhymes of tall and at all, and in the middle you have the pararhyme of toil in between. And incidentally, in the third line of the poem, so in the A and half rhyme, you also have the internal rhyme of home. So at home, whispering of fields half sown. So you have a kind of mixture of internal line full rhymes and then these kind of pararhymes of sown and sun, sort of creating a sense of aural dissonance, of not quite sort of chiming where it ought to. So we note also, importantly I think, that elements of this rigid structure were in place from the very early drafts, even though the diction itself was different. So in a draft version of the poem, the pararhyme for lines 8 and 10 was grain and groan, rather than seeds and sides. But the idea of the vowel rhyme stunt is present. So why does Wilfred Owen kind of use pararhyme so forcefully in the poem? Well, a full rhyme scheme might have implied something too neat and orderly, perhaps, for the chaotic world, or it's not quite fitting world that Owen is trying to create within the poem. So the rhyme scheme, or the pararhyme scheme you might call it, creates a disjointed aural quality, slightly unharmonious, slightly unsettling, slightly uneasy. It creates this sense of kind of uneasy harmony or dissonance. It almost fits, but it doesn't quite. Something isn't quite right. It seems to be the impression that's created through these almost rhymes. Remember, I said a few moments ago that the fifth line in each stanza was an addition to a later version of the poem, and we can see that both line 5, until this morning and this snow, and line 12, was it for this the clay grew tall, make full rhymes with the closing line in each stanza. So both stanzas then end on a full rhyme, now with the addition of these two extra lines, when they were first not supposed to end on a full rhyme, they were supposed to end on a pararhyme. So the introduction then of these two lines introduces a full rhyme which would otherwise not have been present at all in the poem. So what effect does this introduction of the full rhyme have? What is the importance of the half rhymes in between the full rhymes, for a start, in each stanza's closing triplicate? So the words that are emphasised then are now and toil, and they're kind of highlighted by the aural disharmony. So if we take the C rhyme, so this is the first stanza, the fifth and the seventh lines, and the half rhyme, half C rhyme of the sixth line, why might it matter that the sixth line is only a half rhyme? So snow, now, no. Perhaps it shows or implies that now, the present time, is out of step and uneasy and odd. Or perhaps it might bring to mind what a full rhyme of C would be here. No. The word no is a full rhyme with snow and no. So I mean the word no as in N-O rather than the word no as in K-N-O-W. So we might initially think, because of the three I rhymes, so an I rhyme is when a line ending is spelt, two line endings are spelled the same, and so look like they are going to be pronounced the same and so be a rhyme. And of course most of the time I rhymes are full rhymes, as in snow and no. Those are both I rhymes and full rhymes, but now is an I rhyme with those two, but not a full rhyme. So if it were a full rhyme, the sound no would end line 6, which would kind of potentially sound as though it would immediately shut down the hopefulness that the man can be roused. So in terms of, if you were just going with I rhyme, then the sound produced by the I rhyme, the line would read, if anything might rouse him, no. I now want to look at the metre of futility. So significantly, the reference to France in line 4 is emphasised by the poem's form. So the poem Futility is composed in duple metre, that is, in disyllabic metrical feet. So each metrical foot comprises 2 syllables. Move him into the sun. The overall rhythmic pattern is very fixed in the poem. So each stanza opens and closes with trimeter, and in duple metre, trimeter is 6 syllables, 3 metrical feet, 6 syllables overall. So move him into the sun, the kind old sun will know. Think how it wakes the seeds to break earth's sleep at all. And then in the middle of the stanzas are tetrameters. So those are 8 syllables, 4 metrical feet of 2 8 syllables. Gently its touch awoke him once, at home whispering of fields half sown, until this morning and this snow, if anything might rouse him now, woke once the clays of a cold star, our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil? So the exception is line 4. Always it woke him, even in France. So the line referring to France has 9 syllables, in contrast to the surrounding lines of trimeter and tetrameter. So 9 beats or syllables in a duple meter line is called a line of catalectic pentameter. Catalexis derives from the Greek for incomplete. So catalexis, or a catalectic line, is a line of poetry where a beat or a syllable is missing. So a pause is created, often at the end of the line, but not always at the end of the line. So here I would read this line as having the catalectic metrical foot in the middle. So I would read it as, always it woke him, pause, even in France. So I would say, when I read this, that the catalexis creates a pause in the middle of the line, almost as if taking a breath, hesitating before kind of remembering or kind of daring to say, even in France. So the extra syllable, or 2 syllables if you include the pause to kind of make it into an even number of beats, significantly highlights this line. So what is the significance of this extra syllable, extra 2 syllables? Why might Wilfred Owen want to emphasise France? Metrically, France sticks out in the poem. It is odd, it is unusual, but even in this odd, unusual place, the sun has always woken the man, the boy, before. Even here, even in France. In terms of metre, we might also reconsider line 13. Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil? So it can be read with 8 syllables, tetrameter, which is how I read it before. But it can also be read kind of extending the syllables of fatuous and toil to make the line into a line of pentameter. So, oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil? But it sounds a bit laboured. It's sort of extending beyond the lines around it, hourly implying that it is kind of toiling to finish. And the reader actually is, when you find patterns, you want to sort of read it to fit to the pattern. And if you wanted to make it fit to tetrameter, you have to kind of work, you have to toil to keep the kind of rhythmical element of the line. So the metre of the line then, or the reading of the metre of the line, might be said to echo the strain, the toil of the sun. That you want to, instead of making it sound laboured, so, oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil, that's not very kind of hourly appealing. So you want to try and compress it into tetrameter, and you have to kind of strain to do that. Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil? And in order to make it fit, then you don't want to read it quickly, as I just did. You want to slow down. So you're sort of forced to slow down to kind of retain the meter. So you can read it as tetrameter if you say, oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil? It doesn't sound so sort of shoehorned in then. So this sense of slowing the pace and extending the sounds but retaining the meter is enhanced, I think, in the repeated sibilance between words in the closing couplet. So this kind of demand to slow down. So you have fatuous sunbeams. And whenever you have kind of two S sounds together, or often two consonants together at the end of one word and the beginning of the next word, particularly in a line of poetry, you have to slow down, because in order to enunciate it, you have to kind of take a slight breath in between them. Fatuous sunbeams, and the same in Earth's sleep. So again, that's sort of forcing the reader to slow down a bit. I'm now going to compare the two stanzas of Futility. So I said earlier that I would return to the deliberate parallels and comparisons between the two stanzas, which I think is encouraged by the form of the poem itself. So let's look at the beginning of the stanzas then. Both stanzas' opening lines open with an imperative verb, open with a trochee, emphasising the imperative verb, close with an I am, and are punctuated by a final pause at the end of the line, enhanced with a hyphen. So a trochee within duple metre is a stressed and then an unstressed syllable. So move him. An I am is the reverse, an unstressed syllable and then a stressed one. So why does Wilfred Owen structure the poem in this way? Why have this formal repetition? So the trochaic opening to each stanza emphasises the first monosyllabic word, which are, as I've said, both imperative verbs. So move dominates the first stanza, which is concerned with the physical world, and think dominates the second stanza, concerned with the mental world, with rumination. So move is the very first word of the poem. And why might this be significant? The poem literally opens with an instruction: move him. And there is a kind of development from the certainty of the physical move and the instruction, the certainty of that at the poem's opening, to the metaphysical think at the opening of, and then kind of filtering through the second stanza. So we kind of mutate from the certainty of the command at the poem's opening to the uncertainty of the unanswerable rhetorical questions at the close of the poem. The poem furthermore moves from the physical sphere, the soldier, to the kind of metaphysical sphere, contemplating life itself. And this movement is kind of epitomised in the opening imperative verb of both stanzas, from move to think. And there are other rhythmical parallels in the stanzas too. We see trochees and spondees at the opening of equivalent lines in the two different stanzas. So I said earlier, a trochee is where within a metrical foot you have a stressed and then an unstressed syllable, and a spondee is where within a metrical foot you have two stressed syllables. So in both, the first syllable is emphasised, and that's different from an I am, which is a much more usual rhythm in English. So it's not very kind of hourly usual to have the first syllable emphasised, as in a trochee and a spondee. So the opening syllables are emphasised actually in Wilfred Owen's poem Futility, and 8 out of the 14 lines, so a majority of the lines, have this trochee opening, so where the beginning of the line is emphasised. So you have a kind of balance where the end of the line is emphasised to some extent in the pararhyme, and the opening of lines is also emphasised because of the trochee and spondee. So move him gently, always, until, think how, woke once. So there we have a spondee. So previously we had trochees, now we've got a spondee. Full nerved, those are both emphasised too, so it's a spondee. Was it? So why does Owen use this form? Kind of what is the effect of emphasising the openings of the lines? Perhaps we can think of it as emphasising the kind of movement of thought, because as I've said, particularly at the poem's opening, they're very end-stopped lines. So you stop at the end of the line and then you have the emphasis at the beginning of the next line as well. So the new thoughts kind of begin the new lines. So it makes it feel more kind of contemplative, because you're not rushing on to the next line. You kind of pause at the end of the line with the, encouraged by the half rhyme, and then you have this new thought coming in at the beginning of the next one. And that sort of slows the pace overall. But just to read the opening lines then, so you have move him into the sun. Stop. Gently its touch awoke him once. Pause. At home. And then you've got a comma, so it's sort of stopping again, making you pause at the beginning of the line. Whispering of fields half sown. Always it woke him, even in France. So you can see that you were kind of made to stop, and the beginning of each new thought is emphasised rhythmically. So I'm now going to move to look at the middle of the stanzas. So we've got, in the inverted kind of repetition of diction, in the second lines of both stanzas, a kind of extended chiasmus. So chiasmus is where it's like a sort of mirror reflected. You have the beginning and end sort of echoing each other and the middle bits echoing each other. And here it's kind of extended over different lines. And Wilfred Owen encourages the reader to compare the individual boy of the first stanza with the world and with life in general in the second stanza. So, gently its touch awoke him once. Woke once the clays of a cold star. So the diction kind of encourages readers to compare these two lines. In the first stanza, the nurturing sun imagery relates to the one individual, awoke him once. Gently the boy is touched by the warm sun. And the diction is repeated then in woke once the clays in the second stanza to refer to kind of universal clay of the earth, or kind of the clay that man is kind of made of clay, man as a sort of symbol. So it's kind of textually linking one particular individual and life on earth in general. So we can sort of mutate the line to read something like, gently the sun's warm touch woke once the clays of the cold star, of earth and of life generally. So in the first stanza we had the gentle touch of the warm sun, and now we have in the second stanza the kind of alliterative clays of a cold star. It's a sort of slightly cold feeling that's created. The earth doesn't feel warm and life-giving because of the hardness of clays of a cold star. I think the C and the L, clays of a cold star. Cold is quite chilly. It's a kind of onomatopoeic word. It's quite sort of chilly. So is the implication in linking these two images together through diction that if the first is futile, then perhaps the second is futile too, or has been futile too? So is the hope of reviving the boy, if that is futile, was waking the earth at all futile? And moving to the end of each stanza, especially in the closing couplets. So the first example of enjambment in the poem is in the first stanza's closing couplet. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. So this is the end of the first stanza, which offers kind of seeming certainty and comfort, but that is kind of internally undermined to create a sense of aporia, doubt. The couplet personifies the sun, which is described as embodying a kind grandfatherly benevolence that the speaker trusts in. By personifying the sun, is the speaker kind of making it fallible, just as humans are? Are things you want to trust in, like the benevolence of the sun, kind of undermined in the poem? The sun is kind, repeating the sense created in the stanzas earlier gently. So we've got the gentle sun, the kind old sun. But ultimately, it's ineffective. It doesn't matter that it's gentle and kind if it's ineffective, suggesting perhaps that the speaker is kind of losing faith in so-called certainties. And there's a hint of despair, I think, in the bleak "if anything might," and a sense of false certainty in claiming that the son will know what to do. The uncertainty, however, can be charted in the modal verbs might, followed by the falsely cheery will. There's an element of knowing, or at least suspecting, the futility of moving the man into the sun in the mixture of doubt and certainty. So the closing couplet shows the confused state of the speaker, who is perhaps unwilling to acknowledge that the man is dying or dead already. We have the uncertainty and aporia of "if anything might." It's kind of clutching at straws, "if anything might," mixed with the desperate, I think, overly cheery confidence of "the kind old son will know." This is last gasp hope. You've got nothing else to do but move him into the sun and hope the sun will do some magic. The speaker seems to be trying to convince himself. The speaker is trying to believe in the hopefulness of the affirmative statement, will. The kind old son will know what to do. But he has already betrayed himself in the previous line's uncertainty, if, might. And this uncertainty, this doubt, this aporia then leads to the greater questioning of the second stanza. The son is presented as almost a kind of grandfatherly sage. The kind old son will know, but the son does not know what to do, or at least is unable to help, suggesting perhaps that we should question even something as certain, as kind of grandfatherly, as benevolent seeming, etc., as the son. Even the son cannot be trusted, so what else should not be trusted might be the implication. And we note that in an early draft version of the poem, the line reads, "the kind wise son will know," perhaps suggesting that the speaker feels a crisis of previously trusted wisdom. And if we cannot rely even on the son, what can we rely on? The text seems to be asking. The certainty of death only? Looking at the three rhetorical questions at the end of the second stanza, as I said, the poem literally opens with a command: move him. And we move from the certainty of command at the poem's opening to the uncertainty of unanswerable rhetorical questions. Think how at the close of the poem. So our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. This body is still kind of warm on the inside, even though it's frozen on the outside. Why can't it just be stirred? Why can't it be revived? Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? This poem, as I've said, is not about the rage of battle, but trying to make sense of the desolation afterwards. And we can see the speaker's mental anguish in the fact that the poem closes with three unanswerable rhetorical questions in a row, as if such questions now continually plague the speaker. Too much of being dominated or governed by think. And what does the structural difference in the move from statements to questions between the two stanzas imply? Perhaps that in the past the speaker had clung on to certainties, the benevolence of the sun, for example. But those certainties are disintegrating. But does the very fact that the poem ends on these questions undermine a complete sense of total futility? To some extent, perhaps. If the speaker wholly accepted that everything was completely pointless, then he would have stopped questioning the purpose of life, wouldn't he? Does ending on a question mark offer some small sliver of hope, then, that life is not entirely futile if one can still question the meaning of life? We might remember the Cartesian, René Descartes, the 17th century philosopher, his kind of philosophical dictum, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Even if you have nothing else, if you can think, then you know you exist. Unlike the dead man, who can no longer move or think. Is there perhaps some comfort to take from this? It cannot be entirely futile if you can still think about what is the point of life. I now want to look at the allusions in futility, particularly at the line, "Was it for this the clay grew tall?" So was it for this? And we remember that this is a later addition to the poem, as we know from the manuscripts that we consulted earlier. So this question, was it for this, has kind of epic and indeed mock epic allusions. The phrase was often employed in a questioning of a kind of particular lament. So the formation of this seemingly simple question has a heavy literary heritage. Was it for this is a classical question of epic poetry. So the question was initially from Virgil's Aeneid. In Book 2, Aeneas asks, "Was it for this, gracious mother, that you saved me amid fire and sword, to see the foe in the heart of my home, and Ascanius and my father and Creusa at their side slaughtered in each other's blood?" And then again, this kind of association of death and kind of horrible bloodshed in Book 4, when Anna asks her sister Dido, who is preparing a suicide pyre, "Was it for this, sister, did you aim your fraud at me? Was this for me the meaning of your pyre, this the meaning of your altar and fires?" And the phrase was later repeated in other epic poems in English literature, such as William Wordsworth's two-part prelude, which was written in 1798 to 99, when Wordsworth was trying to grapple with the meaning of his life and the purpose of his life. And Wordsworth's epic questioning opens, and it's much longer and more sort of diffuse, but the structure remains the same. And he opens his prelude, at least in his first version, "Was it for this, that one, the fairest of all rivers, loved to blend his murmurs with my nurse's song? And from his older shades and rocky falls, and from his fords and shallows sent a voice that flowed along my dreams. For this didst thou, O Derwent, travelling over the green plains, giving me, among the fretful dwellings of mankind, a knowledge, a dim earnest of the calm which nature breathes among the fields and groves." W.B. Yeats used the same structure, writing in the same decade as Wilfred Owen wrote Futility, in his poem September 1913. "Was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing upon every tide, for this that all that blood was shed?" Indeed, by the 18th century, so 200 years before Wilfred Owen was writing, the phrase had become so associated with serious epic lamentation that Alexander Pope would mock it in his brilliant mock epic poem The Rape of the Lock, which was first published in 1712. When Belinda has her lock of hair stolen, the narrative voice kind of ridiculously laments this theft. So the joke is that, she'd taken so much trouble over her hair and her hair care only for this lock of hair to be stolen. And the text reads, "Was it for this you took such constant care. The bodkin, so bodkin is a kind of large needle that you might use to sort of pin your hair. Was it for this you took such constant care, the bodkin, comb and essence to prepare? For this your locks in paper durance bound, for this with torturing irons wreathed around, for this with fillets strained your tender head, and bravely bore the double loads of lead. That Pope could mock the structure in a mock heroic poem, and I mean mock in the two senses of the word, so mock as in imitate and mock as in poke fun at, that he could use this form and this structure shows just how established it was in conventional epic writing, certainly in English translations. So by the time that Wilfred Owen was writing then, the phrase had become very heavily associated with a kind of profound epic moment of kind of lamenting exclamation, where the questioner is trying to make sense of what has happened to them. What was it all for? Was it for this? Why might Wilfred Owen draw on this classical epic allusion here in this poem's question? The poem Futility has the distilled kind of epic trope of a hero appealing to the gods in this question, almost, and his kind of despair at the impotence and the seeming indifference of those gods, or of that other that he's kind of appealing to in this rhetorical question. Was it for this the clay grew tall? What is the purpose of it all? Why was it for this? So the poem is kind of partially then epic in scope and scale, in making these allusions, these kind of grand epic allusions to kind of traditional laments, even though it is only a sonnet in form. I now want to look at the word clay. So what is the significance in the repetition of the word clay in lines 9 and lines 12? The word clay has relevant biblical and literary associations. So originally for line 9, Wilfred Owen had written sands, woke even the sands of a cold star, but chose to amend it to clay instead. Why? Well, we can look at the religious imagery kind of associated with the word clay. Perhaps Owen is drawing on biblical diction and allusion, invoking God in using the term clay. So this is from the King James Bible, Isaiah. But now, O Lord, thou art our Father. We are the clay, and thou art potter, and we are all the work of thy hand. And there's also a literary allusion, well, a kind of Bible literary allusion. It might also be a reference to John Milton's Paradise Lost, first published in 1667, where Adam, obviously kind of symbolic of man, more generally the first man, frustratedly asks God, questions God, did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mould me man? Why did you give birth to me, God? Adam is essentially asking. I didn't ask to be born. Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mould me man? Did I ask you to make me? And this is itself an allusion to Isaiah again. Woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Shall the clay say to him that fashioneth it, what makest thou? So that's kind of that's what's dramatised in Paradise Lost, in having Adam ask this question. In other words, you shouldn't question God why you were made. Woe unto him that striveth with his maker, and asks, shall the clay say to him that fashioneth it, what makest thou? So Adam's questioning in Paradise Lost is later picked up in important texts such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was published in 1818, where the creature asks Frankenstein this same question, why did you make me? was it for this? Why did you make me? And it's also the novels, Frankenstein's, the novels, epigram. The implication of all these allusions is that woe will come to those who frustratedly ask such questions, who kind of accusingly question existence, its purpose, and the maker of life. Are these allusions comforting to the speaker of Wilfred Owen's poem? Or do they suggest perhaps that religion is futile too, or at least seeking comfort in religion is futile too? That God, like the sun, seems perhaps to have abandoned him. Might it ask, what is the responsibility of the maker in the fate of those that they make? Was it for this? Why did you make me? Was it for this? As I mentioned earlier, the line, was it for this that the clay grew tall, was a later insertion into the poem. It is seemingly simple, and yet it has this heavy kind of philosophical, really, that's a very fundamental philosophical question. Why did you make me? If I'm experiencing all this suffering and all this pain and all this torment, all this anguish, all this heartbreak, everything horrible you can imagine, why did you make me, God? Why did you make me? So it has that kind of heavy heritage. It's got classical epic heritage in the phrasing of the question, epic heritage also in the allusion to Paradise Lost, which is of course English literature's foremost epic poem, but also in the biblical heritage too. And the weight of all these allusions indicates what a profound existential crisis the speaker is experiencing in this moment. And Owen wanted to insert this existential crisis, a kind of heightened sense of existential crisis in making this additional line. There's one possible further use of biblical imagery and allusion too, in the word sides. So we might note that Owen uses the word sides in his description of the dead boy, of the dead man. Our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full-nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Now you might think that's a slightly odd word there, our sides full-nerved, still warm. Why did he mention sides? Well, perhaps it's to do with the King James Bible and an allusion to that. So at the crucifixion, Jesus Christ's sides were pierced. So this is from John. One of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. So we've got this sort of imagery of the blood coming from Jesus' side, and the blood of, full-nerved, still warm, that this boy still has kind of warm blood in his veins. Why can't he just be roused? So thus, perhaps in using sides to describe the dying boy, the dead soldier, Wilfred Owen kind of encourages implications, or makes the reader perhaps think of the implications of sacrifice, or possible resurrection, or possible redemption. I want to close by considering the poem's title and whether we might think that there's a kind of metatextual irony in the choice of the word futility. So at one point in the drafting process, the poem was titled Frustration instead. Frustration, then, is one of the central emotions that Wilfred Owen was channeling in the poem's creation and composition. But clearly, Wilfred Owen thought that futility ultimately was more fitting, and we might ask why. Well, perhaps by titling the poem Futility, he's kind of thereby already providing the answer to the poem's rhetorical questions. Does this, ironically, add to the sense of futility even further? The very act of reading the poem itself is partially futile if we have already been told that futility is its meaning. before we have even begun to read the poem. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe. And if you have liked the video, then do please press the thumbs up button. It helps me out in YouTube's algorithm. Thank you to everyone who has supported my channel. Your support really is appreciated. And I'd love to know, what are your interpretations and your analyses of Wilfred Owen's poem Futility? Do leave your comments below.